Hello everyone, very good morning and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So before we begin our discussion, we have an important announcement. The online batch, which has been starting from 28th Feb, is going to begin today. Sham sir will be conducting the evening classes starting from today, and you can enroll for the program by calling this number provided over here. We're also offering a 50% discount with a 6-month free extension on the subscription. So do ensure that you make the full benefit out of this offer. So let's take a look at the topics that we're going to discuss today. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 6 important articles. There are 3 articles that require a detailed analysis, largely from a mains point of view. And we have 3 more articles which are important for the prelims examination. So let's cover these topics one by one, and let's ensure that this is a comprehensive discussion so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you're liking the initiative, do support us with your likes, with your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's begin with the discussion by looking at this column from page number 10. In this column, the writer is talking about the United Nations and the international institutional system that has been created to maintain peace and stability in the world. The writer is mainly talking about the UN as an organization, its origin, the role of UN and how UN has become ineffective in dealing with conflicts and other global issues. The writer is also referring to other global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and how they have been dominated by few countries, whereas rest of the other powers have been left out from the decision making at these key institutions. So the writer is essentially calling for reforms of global institutions, particularly the reforms of the United Nations. So let's understand this topic in detail, because even India has been strongly advocating for UN reforms and reforms of many other global institutions. The context of this article is that the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has recently remarked about the lack of unity amongst UN members, particularly within the UN Security Council. Currently, the world is dealing with multiple conflicts, including the Russia-Ukraine war, the Gaza war, and many other conflict situations. Despite this, the UN has been highly ineffective in preventing these conflicts or even in achieving a ceasefire. So there has been condemnation of the UN, of how UN has become ineffective over the years. And this statement has been reiterated by none other than the Secretary General of the United Nations. In fact, the Secretary General himself has become quite pessimistic about the role of UN in the global geopolitical world order. So it's in this context that we should examine the structure of the UN, the origin, its history. Why was it established? What are its objectives? And what is the need to reform this organization? According to Antonio Guterres, the lack of unity within the UN Security Council, particularly amongst the permanent members, whom we refer to as the P5, the 5 permanent members of UNSC, the lack of unity amongst them and how they have been divided on important conflicts and issues, this has undermined the UN as an organization. So the only way out of this situation is to reform the institution. So that is what the writer is talking about. So let's talk about the origin, the history of the UN. Why was it established? When was it established? What are its core objectives? What are the structural problems affecting the functioning of the UN? Many of you might have asked yourself this question as to why the UN is ineffective in dealing with any global crisis. For example, if you remember during the pandemic, right, the UN barely played a role in achieving international cooperation. During the Russia-Ukraine war, there was nothing much the UN could do to put pressure on Russia. With regard to the Gaza war, where Palestinians are being killed in large numbers in this ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, even there the UN has been largely ineffective. So every now and then this question comes to our mind as to why the UN is not doing anything. We've asked this question when things turned bad in Afghanistan, when a crisis broke out in Myanmar, So anywhere in the world, whenever there are these conflicts, wars, and other crisis situations, we see that the United Nations is largely missing in action. Rather, the UN is not able to resolve the conflict and establish peace and stability. The irony is that that was the very purpose for which UN was established. The core objective of the United Nations, when it was established in 1945, was to establish peace and maintain security in the world. But today we have seen that the UN is largely ineffective in resolving any conflict or any dispute. So this is where the question comes up as to why the UN has become ineffective. And to find answers to this question, we have to go back in time, go back in history, look at the origin of the UN, the way it was established, the way it was structured, and what problems exist within the United Nations. See, the answer here lies in the early part of the 20th century. The First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, it had divided the world, and there was no global entity or an organization or international law to prevent such global conflicts from happening again. So following the end of the First World War, there was a peace settlement between the Allied powers and the axis of evil, right? The Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in Paris, provided for the end of the First World War, following which the Allied powers, led by Britain and even France, they decided to establish a global institution to prevent future wars and conflicts, to ensure that peace and stability is maintained, to ensure that such divisions and rivalries do not come up between different countries. For this purpose, the League of Nations was established through the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was one of the first major international organizations, and it is seen as the predecessor of the United Nations. The primary mandate of League of Nations was to prevent wars and conflicts. Its primary mandate was to ensure that another global war does not occur. But again, ironically, League of Nations itself contributed in many ways to the start of the Second World War. You might have studied this in world history. How League of Nations was abused by the victors of First World War. Those who won the First World War, the Allied powers, primarily Britain and France, they largely misused the League of Nations for their own advantage. They inflicted humiliation on Germany. They extracted a lot of taxes from Germany, the war reparations. They occupied and divided all the colonies of Germany and the other axis of powers, right? They basically divided, they looted the wealth, the colonies that were with Germany and other countries that were allied with Germany. So this meted out humiliation to Germany, which in a way contributed to the rise of far right-wing ideology under Hitler's Nazi Germany, right? When Hitler came to power, right, his rise to power was built on the agenda that he would restore Germany back to its glory, that he would ensure that Germany would become a strong nation and it would be able to counter Britain, France, which were humiliating Germany, right? So League of Nations became a tool in the hands of the victors of First World War to humiliate the countries which lost the conflict. And in many ways, it contributed to new divisions. In a way, it enabled the rise of fascist ideology, far right-wing ideology, including the ideology of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. So League of Nations was seen as a major failure because by 1940s, the world was more divided. And we started seeing the breakout of Second World War, and there was nothing that League of Nations could do. It was highly ineffective. So following the failure of League of Nations and the start of the Second World War, some global powers, they realized that we needed a new institution to replace the League of Nations. It was very well known that League of Nations had become an ineffective global organization. So during the Second World War, when the Second World War had already started, in 1941, the Atlantic Charter was signed between United States and United Kingdom. This was before US entered the Second World War, when the Second World War was still largely restricted to Europe. Prior to that, US and UK signed a charter called the Atlantic Charter, where they laid out their aims during the Second World War. Their stated objectives in the Second World War was laid out under the Atlantic Charter. Through the Atlantic Charter, the then global powers, that is United Kingdom and United States, they resolved to ensure that countries do not threaten the territorial integrity of other countries. Their primary commitment was to protect the principle of self-determination, to protect territorial integrity of nations, to ensure that no aggressive country will threaten the integrity of the other nations, to ensure that people of a particular region will decide on the type of self-government that they would like to have. With this objective in mind, Atlantic Charter was signed, and they also committed that there won't be any trade restrictions. They would provide for global cooperation between the countries to ensure that there is international stability. So this was the primary agenda of Atlantic Charter, and this is seen as the initial step taken by US and UK towards the establishment of United Nations. Following this, US President Franklin Roosevelt, FD Roosevelt, during the war period, during the Second World War, he coined the term United Nations. He said countries have to unite, have to function together under international law to prevent such conflicts, to promote international collaboration and cooperation. So the idea of a UN was taking shape during the Second World War, and the basis for that was the Atlantic Charter. This essentially laid the foundation for the idea of United Nations. So as the Second World War was winding down and almost coming to an end in 1945, a global conference was held in San Francisco, also called the San Francisco Conference. The UN Conference on International Organization was convened by the United States in 1945 with the goal of establishing a new international organization that could replace the League of Nations. So through the San Francisco Conference, the UN Charter was brought out. The UN Charter is essentially the constitution of the United Nations. So several countries from around the world participated in the San Francisco Conference, and there were Indian representatives as well. Even though India was yet to become independent, there were Indian representatives who took part in the San Francisco Conference. So in a way, India also played a role in drafting the UN Charter. So under the UN Charter, the structure of the UN was outlined. The objectives of the UN has been clearly spelled out. The role of the UN has been specified. So this is the constitution of the UN. So once the UN Charter was adopted following the San Francisco Conference, the United Nations came into being. In 1945, with the end of the Second World War, a new global organization was established to replace the League of Nations, which was seen as a failure. As I told you, in many ways, League of Nations contributed to more divisions, and in a way, it contributed to the start of the Second World War. So now it was replaced by a new organization called United Nations, and its structure, objectives, and role was defined through the UN Charter. Several organs were established under the UN, and how these organs would interact, what powers they would have, what is the voting process. All these procedures were also defined under the UN Charter itself. So the entire structure of the UN, the role, the function of the UN has been contained in this document, that is the UN Charter. So today this forms the basis of international law. This provided for the establishment of the UN, and it outlined the core principles and objectives of the UN. It's very important to understand these principles and objectives. The primary objective of the UN was to maintain peace and stability, to ensure that there is no conflict, no war, to ensure that disputes are resolved peacefully through talks and negotiations instead of resorting to war and conflict. The idea was to prevent a World War III. That was the primary goal of the UN, to maintain peace and stability, to resolve conflicts, to settle disputes, to mediate between rival countries and hostile countries, and ensure that stability is maintained between them. This was the primary goal, primary agenda of the United Nations. Apart from that, there were few other objectives which were also outlined under the UN Charter. Since the two world wars had destroyed the global economy, particularly the European economy, there was a need to reconstruct the global economy. There was a need to focus on the welfare state model. Countries were looking at reconstruction following the war efforts. They were dealing with a massive refugee crisis as well. Particularly in Europe, there was a massive refugee crisis. During the war, there were large-scale human rights violations. Germany in particular had committed a genocide against the Jews and other minorities. Mussolini's Italy, Imperial Japan, they all committed brutal atrocities during the Second World War. There were large-scale human rights violations. There was a massive humanitarian situation due to the refugee crisis. There was an urgent need to move away from the police state model, where states had focused excessively on security. There was a need to move away from the police state model and implement the welfare state model to rebuild and reconstruct the economies that were destroyed. There was a need to focus on social welfare, infrastructure development. Plus, the war efforts had also polluted our environment. It had caused enormous pollution. First, the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s had already contributed to large-scale pollution. The air, water, soil, everything was polluted due to large-scale industrial activities. The war efforts had further caused pollution of the environment, and finally, there was some awakening regarding protection of environment. So all these goals were also included under the UN Charter. The UN was given a goal to focus on economic, social and cultural development, to create international cooperation between countries, to focus on economic and social and cultural development. The UN committed to uphold human rights and to assist people who are in crisis, those who are affected by wars or even by disasters, maybe earthquakes or cyclones, etc. Right? For the first time, disaster management also was given importance following the adoption of the UN Charter, and providing such relief, humanitarian relief, became one of the goals of the United Nations. Providing humanitarian relief became one of the priority goals of the UN. So along with upholding human rights and rehabilitating the refugees, providing humanitarian relief became another important objective of the UN. It also started focusing on environment protection, tackling pollution, etc. And it also started focusing on the welfare model, dealing with poverty, tackling hunger, ensuring that people have enough food, ensuring that there is access to education, healthcare. These social objectives became integral to the UN system. So these core principles and objectives of the UN, they are outlined under the UN Charter itself. So to execute these objectives, to implement these principles and goals, there were primary organs of the UN that were established through the UN Charter. The structure of the UN was defined by establishing 6 primary organs, 6 principal organs. The structure of the UN was defined. So this established the UN General Assembly, the UNGA. The UN General Assembly, it has universal representation. All the recognized countries of the world, they all have membership of UN General Assembly. This is the most democratic of all the organs of the UN. Every country has an equal representation and every country has an equal vote. So this is where all key global issues are discussed, debated, some resolutions are passed and adopted, etc. But unfortunately, the flaw with the structure of the UN is that the UNGA is not the most powerful organ. Even though it's the most inclusive, democratic and equal organ of all the other organs, it has not been vested with key powers. The key powers have been vested with an elite body called the UN Security Council, the UNSC. Compared to the UNGA, the UN Security Council has been vested with critical powers, which makes UNSC the most powerful organ of the United Nations. For example, if you look at the right or the power to maintain peace and stability, if you look at the role of the UN in enforcing economic sanctions, or if you look at the power of the UN to authorize an invasion of a country, to authorize the use of force against a hostile country, if you look at the control over UN peacekeeping forces, then if you look at core and critical issues like countering terrorism, focusing on nuclear disarmament, all these global issues related to security, peace and stability, they have been vested with the UN Security Council. The problem is that UNSC is an elite body. There are only 15 members in the UN Security Council. You have the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members, the then dominant powers of the world, which were basically the victors of Second World War, the Allied powers essentially. They were given the permanent status. These permanent powers of UNSC, they are popularly referred to as the P5. It includes the United States, UK and France. Then initially it was Soviet Union, now it is Russia, and then China. So all the Allied powers essentially, they themselves became the permanent members of UN Security Council. So this representation, even though it seemed to be a fair system back then, today it appears to be an outdated and unfair and unequal system. Because these 5 permanent members, they have a tremendous power, which is the veto power. They can veto any resolution. There are 10 non-permanent members as well. UNSC is a 15-member body. The non-permanent members are elected once in every 2 years. They are elected for a 2-year term on a rotational basis, and there is a geographical representation. For every region, there are a certain number of seats that are reserved, and the elections are held on a rotational basis. So India also has become a member of UNSC, non-permanent member. We have held this seat for 8 terms. We have been elected as a non-permanent member 8 times since 1945 till now. But non-permanent members don't really have any authority. They don't have the veto power. The veto right is limited to the 5 permanent members of UNSC. So this elite body becomes the most powerful organ on this ground. Even though UN General Assembly has universal representation and equal voting powers, it doesn't have the critical powers to authorize the use of force against a country, to authorize a invasion which is backed by the UN. It doesn't have the powers to enforce sanctions, economic sanctions. It doesn't have the powers to deal with global conflicts. It doesn't have the powers to even control the UN peacekeeping forces or even to deal with global issues, security issues like terrorism, nuclear disarmament, etc. The UN General Assembly can only discuss, debate. At the maximum, it can adopt a resolution, nothing beyond that. The real authority vests with the UNSC, and that too with the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members who have the veto. So this is where the structural flaw of the UN comes up, right? This is an unfair, unequal system which has been created, which persists even today. And that is why India points out at the UN, and we call the UN an outdated organization. Maybe in 1945, the structure made sense, as these were the most stable and powerful countries of that time which could provide guidance to the world. But today the reality has changed. The geopolitical reality has changed. In the last 30-40 years, there are many other middle powers which have risen to influence. There are many other major powers across the world playing a critical role in their respective regions. From India to Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, Russia, right? There are many countries which play a key role, but very few of them have been given a seat. If you look at the emerging economies, Russia is the one which has a seat, China is the one which has a seat, but India, Brazil, South Africa have been left out. In fact, Africa, South America, they have no representation at all. 2 entire continents have been completely left out from the UNSC, right? The whole of Asia, which is the most populated region in the world, is represented by only one country, that is China. So this is clearly unfair and unequal representation. Europe has 2 exclusive seats given to Britain and France. If you see Russia as a Eurasian power, then Europe has got 3 seats. Whereas Africa, South America have 0 representation, whole of Asia has just 1 representation. So that is how unfair this UN system is. And this system which has been created, this flawed system, is what gives rise to the structural problems of the United Nations. Of course, there are other organs. You have the Economic and Social Council, the ECOSOC, which focuses on economic welfare programs, all your climate change related initiatives, all the initiatives related to sustainable development goals, millennium development goals, right? All these initiatives which are related to social development, economic development, cultural development, they all fall under the mandate of Economic and Social Council. Then we had the Trusteeship Council, which was administering the trusteeship territories, essentially the colonies that were left behind by the Axis powers, which lost the Second World War. So these colonies around the world were administered directly by the UN until they were prepared for self-rule. But by 1990s, all these former colonies, they became independent countries. With that, the function of Trusteeship Council came to an end. So Trusteeship Council doesn't function anymore, right? It has been dormant because it achieved its role. Its role was to ensure that the former colonies of the Axis powers, they are prepared for self-rule and they are given independence. So after 40 years of effort, after UN administering these trusteeship territories, eventually they all became independent nations and the role and function of Trusteeship Council came to an end. Then finally, the other organ is the ICJ, International Court of Justice, which is the judicial arm or the judicial organ of the UN. ICJ is headquartered at The Hague in Netherlands. It's the only UN primary organ which is not in New York. Because see, UN is headquartered in New York. All the other organs are headquartered in New York itself. ICJ is the only primary organ which is not in New York, it's in Netherlands at The Hague. So it is meant to settle disputes between the UN member states. For example, recently South Africa has filed a genocide case against Israel at the ICJ. Recently, India-Pakistan also had a case at the ICJ. India approached ICJ against Pakistan to get a stay order on the death penalty that was given to Kulbhushan Jadhav, who's been accused of being an Indian agent. Right? So whenever such disputes are coming up between member states, they can approach ICJ to get them resolved. And these orders of ICJ will be binding because countries have signed and adopted the UN Charter. Right? Since ICJ draws its powers from the UN Charter, right, the orders of ICJ becomes legally binding on all the member countries. So this is the structure. There is a secretariat as well, which provides secretarial assistance. And this whole structure that you're seeing here, especially the equation between the General Assembly and Security Council, is what is seen as a flawed structure. Because even though UNGA has universal equal representation, it doesn't have the real authority, the real powers, but they have been vested with an elite body, that is the UNSC. Even within these 15 countries, only 5 of them have the veto power, which gives them full authority to veto any resolution. Now, even if 4 permanent members are supporting a resolution, if just one country doesn't support it and uses its veto, then the whole resolution will fail. Now, let's say, for example, all countries have agreed to put sanctions on Russia, just hypothetically. All the countries, 190 plus countries, which are members of UN General Assembly, they will all support it, right? Even at the Security Council, 4 permanent members will support it. Assume hypothetically even China is supporting it. But Russia, right, against whom the sanctions are being brought up, can use its veto power and defeat that whole resolution, even though every country is supporting it. So essentially, countries are using the veto for their own geopolitical interests. The United States, then United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, they've all been using the veto to serve their own national interests, their own geopolitical self-interests. They're not concerned about the global interests. They're not concerned about international law. So this is a flaw that India has been pointing out from many years. At least from 30 years, India has been pointing out that the UN structure is outdated. The very structure of giving veto only to 5 countries and leaving out the rest is a flawed structure. So that is why India has been pushing for UN reforms to ensure UN becomes effective. But the reforms can never happen without the approval of the P5. Without P5 countries agreeing to it, reforms cannot be carried out because they can veto the resolutions. If you look at United States, even Russia, UK, France, they have at least given verbal support. Verbally, they have committed to India and few other countries that yes, the permanent seats have to be expanded at the Security Council. They welcomed India and few other countries to join the Security Council, verbally at least. But China has always been in opposition of any UN reforms, especially inclusion of new permanent members. India has been pushing for it. We even have formed an informal club called the G4. India is aligned with like-minded countries such as Japan, Brazil, and Germany. So these 4 countries, that is India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany, these 4 countries are strongly pushing for UN reforms. Some countries have at least given verbal support. US, even Russia, UK, and France, they have verbally welcomed the G4 countries, in particular India. They have said that India deserves a seat at the permanent table of the UN Security Council. But on the ground, they have not done anything concrete. Even they have not initiated any negotiations or discussions. But China is primarily opposed. By principle, it is opposed to any negotiations on UN reforms. So these countries which have the veto can basically stall the negotiations itself. India has been pushing for it from so many years with the help of the G4 countries, but the UN reforms are not going forward. So this is a critical flaw that the writer is also pointing out. If you look at the other international institutions that are there, the IMF and World Bank, which largely govern the financial system, right? Even the structure here is highly flawed. These were also a result of the UN-led global system. The United Nations organized the Monetary and Financial Conference in the year 1944. As the UN was taking shape, before UN was established formally, in 1944, a conference was held on monetary and financial system of the world, right? This is what we popularly refer to as the Bretton Woods Conference. It was held at the popular Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire. So this conference is also popularly referred to as the Bretton Woods Conference. This led to the establishment of 2 important global institutions, financial institutions, which is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also known as the World Bank. Right? So World Bank and IMF were established through the Bretton Woods Conference. That's why they're also called Bretton Woods institutions. So these institutions, financial institutions, which have controlled the global economy, even their structure is highly flawed. If you look at the voting structure, if you look at the voting share, if you look at the role of IMF and World Bank and who has played a dominating role, it is again the Western countries. The World Bank has been largely dominated by United States. The World Bank chairman is always an American candidate, a US candidate. Either it would be an American citizen, or even if it's someone else, it's always a US-backed candidate. So US has a very high degree of control on the World Bank, which is a development bank. It plays a key role in providing development financing, in providing loans and investments and assistance to various countries, which can be invested in developmental projects. Even though all countries are contributing to World Bank, their voting share is very limited. The US retains the lion's share of the power with the help of the European allies. If you look at IMF, which is supposed to help out countries facing a liquidity crisis, right? The IMF is also Western dominated, particularly by European powers. The European Union and West European countries, they have a dominating control over the IMF. The IMF chairman is always a European citizen from a West European country. So West European countries have maintained a stronghold over the IMF, and the assistance given by IMF is highly problematic for developing and underdeveloped countries. If a developing nation is facing a liquidity crisis or an economic crisis, and if they approach IMF for a bailout package, for assistance, The IMF will provide assistance, but the assistance given is conditional. Only if you fulfill the conditions laid down by IMF, which could compromise your economic sovereignty, only then IMF will give you assistance. India itself has been a victim of this. In 1991, when we faced the balance of payments crisis and we took assistance from IMF, right, there were many unfair conditions imposed by the IMF. For example, we were forced to devalue the currency. We were forced to open up the markets in such a way that it would benefit Western companies and Western investors. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, many other countries which have taken IMF support, they've all faced similar problems where IMF places many conditions. It forces the countries to open up their economy so that Western companies and Western investors can benefit. So this is how US and European countries have controlled the global financial and economic system, right? The US would ensure that the dollar would become the reserve currency. The US would control the monetary flow. It would control the financial flow by dominating the World Bank. European countries have used IMF to ensure that they get access to other markets, to ensure they can continue their economic domination. But the worst part is that today things have changed. Today emerging economies have contributed more funds to IMF and World Bank. If you look at the BRICS countries, for example, the BRICS grouping was formed because of this very reason. The fact that IMF and World Bank were unfair and dominated by US and Europe is what led to the creation of the BRICS grouping. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa. These countries came together because they felt that their voting share was not increasing. They were given a very less vote share, even though their contribution had gone up over the years. Right? They believed that the US and European domination of IMF and World Bank was unfair, and that is why they challenged the global economic and financial order and established the BRICS organization. After the 2008 recession, which was largely a result of the crisis in Western markets, especially in the American market, right? The recession was largely a result of poor regulatory policies in the US. The failure of the US economy had a global effect and it dragged down the global economy, including the economy of developing nations. They all paid the price. But when these countries would ask for a higher share in the voting rights at IMF, this would be denied to the emerging economies. Right? US and European countries would continue their domination of the global economic and financial system, and this has again become a flawed international structure. Just like how UN has become a flawed international structure, similarly, IMF and World Bank also has its own set of flaws. If you look at the World Trade Organization, which was established in 1995, right? Even here you find a similar issue between developed and developing countries with regard to free trade and global trade. This is connected to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which is the predecessor of WTO that was established in 1947 through the United Nations. It was the UN which brought the countries together to create a global trading framework, to create a level playing field for everyone. And the GATT was established for this purpose. But since the creation of the GATT, and since it was replaced by WTO in 1995, the issue has always persisted between developed countries and developing economies. Developing countries always have the same concern that developed nations are trying to enforce their interests on developing and underdeveloped countries. Developing nations are not given enough space to grow themselves, to provide subsidies to their population, to provide basic food security to their people. For example, right now developed countries have an accusation against India that we provide a lot of subsidies to our farmers through MSP, minimum support price. But in a country like India, it is essential to provide a minimum support price, not just to support the farmers and guarantee of income, a minimum income for farmers, but also to ensure that we have enough supplies to provide for food security, to meet the food security obligations of the nation. Right? The food subsidy that we provide is essential, but developed countries are against it. As of now, there is a moratorium on penalizing countries like India, but India is asking for a permanent solution for the food subsidy problem, which is opposed by developed countries. We have the same issue with intellectual property rights. If you look at the TRIPS arrangement under WTO, developed countries, they want very strict enforcement of IP laws. But it can't be done in developing nations like India and other countries because very strict IP regime will make drugs unaffordable, especially essential life-saving drugs will become unaffordable to the common man, right? So we have the right to issue a compulsory license when it comes to patented drugs to provide for generic version of these drugs. But developed countries have a problem with that. They regularly file complaints and disputes against India and other countries whenever they produce generic drugs and issue compulsory license. So like this, in every other sector of global trade, there are many disputes and issues between developed and developing countries. But unfortunately, the WTO system has not been able to resolve them. The IMF and World Bank have been functioning in an unfair manner where voting share is largely cornered by US and European countries with very limited share for the emerging economies. The global south has been largely neglected. Right? We saw how the UN structure itself is flawed. Now let me tell you something very interesting. I'm sure all of you have heard about UN peacekeeping forces, which are deployed to maintain peace in a conflict-hit country. Countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Philippines, Kenya, these are the countries which are the troop contributing countries. It's all countries from global south like India, Pakistan, Kenya, Bangladesh and others who are contributing troops to UN peacekeeping forces. We are deploying our soldiers, risking the lives of our soldiers in the conflicts of other countries. But guess who controls the deployment of UN peacekeeping forces? Guess who is responsible for their safety? It is only the P5. They are not deploying their soldiers. If you look at US or China or Russia or France, UK, the 5 permanent members, they don't contribute to UN peacekeeping forces. They rely on forces from developing and underdeveloped countries, but they control their deployment, their safety, their issues. So this has been a concern for India that troop contributing countries should have a say in the deployment of the peacekeeping forces with regard to their safety. Because India has lost more than 170 soldiers over the last few decades. Just last year, a few Indian soldiers were killed in Democratic Republic of Congo. So who will take responsibility for that? India is contributing soldiers. We are providing troops in the interest of maintaining peace, security and stability, which is a commitment we have made to the UN. But we have no control over these forces. The control is exercised only by the P5 countries. So this is again an unfair system, which is exactly what India points out. So that is why there is a need to reform the global institutions. Not just the United Nations, even the financial institutions such as IMF and World Bank, trade-related platforms like WTO, etc. The global south countries, they have made their own efforts in the past, but nothing has worked. They've tried the G77 group, which has brought all the developing, underdeveloped countries together. There are more than 130 countries which are part of G77. It has exerted pressure on the developed countries, but it isn't enough. Back in 1950s, 60s, India championed the non-aligned movement to create a non-imperial, decolonized model so that we could end the geopolitical rivalries and provide for a third neutral path. But after a few years, the non-aligned movement largely fell apart, right? So every now and then, the UN, the IMF, World Bank and other global institutions, they have been exposed. They have been ineffective in dealing with any situation, be it the pandemic, be it the ongoing wars, the situation in Afghanistan, the question of terrorism, the nuclear rogue states, nuclear proliferation which has happened from Pakistan, right? UN never held Pakistan accountable for that. Why? Because the US was backing Pakistan. The US had enough influence to ensure that Pakistan is protected. So this has always been a concern with the global institutions, and essentially the writer is calling for a complete reform of these institutions. That is the core point of the article. It's a very detailed article actually. In fact, you can expect questions on these lines in your mains. There can be prelims related questions as well with regard to some important facts that we have discussed. So I feel it's a very, very interesting and important article, and please take a look at this, go through the article again if you have the time, so that you're fully prepared for a possible question on this topic. Now, before I start with the next topic, take a look at the schedule of NCERT Fundamentals, which is a free special class going on the Unacademy app, where we conduct these live sessions every morning from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. So this is the schedule for this week, and these are the special classes we have today. This is the schedule for 28th Feb. The links for these sessions are provided in the description box below. Now let's look at the next important column from page number 12 that deals with funding in India for science and technology and research and development. The article is exploring the lack of funding for science and research in India, because today, the 28th of Feb, marks the National Science Day. We celebrate this day across the country as National Science Day because it was on this historic day that C.V. Raman discovered the Raman effect, for which he won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1930. So to mark C.V. Raman's contribution and to pay tribute to India's scientific research and scientific establishment, 28th Feb every year is marked as National Science Day. So on this occasion, the Hindu carries a detailed article on the science and technology sector in India, especially fundamental research and basic research, which requires more funding. Because without adequate funding for research and development, you cannot aspire to be a scientific power. Today, India is very ambitious. India has set a goal to become a developed country by 2047. And you can't become a developed country without investing enough in scientific research and development. If you look at any other developed country or fast-growing countries, they've all risen to power based on their achievements in science and technology. Be it United States, be it European countries, be it China as well, which is an emerging global power, right? They've all risen to power based on their scientific base, based on the intellectual property that they have created. So India also is a leading country in the field of scientific research and development, but the problem is we don't have enough funding in the country. We have ambitious goals and plans. The Modi government has said that India should become a Viksit Bharat by 2047. It has ambitious plans for science and technology, from space to biotechnology to nanotechnology. There are multiple missions. The National Semiconductor Mission, there is a separate mission for quantum computing, there is a separate focus on artificial intelligence, right? The government has a few priorities. It has created the right policies, but the problem is there isn't enough money in India to fund scientific research and development. So that is the highlight of this article. It's focusing on science funding in India. What is the extent of funding we are providing? Where do we stand when we compare with other countries? And what should be done to increase the budgetary allocation for research and development? That is the focus of the article. According to the article, if India has to transform itself, if India has to uplift itself from a developing nation to a developed country in the next 2 decades, we need to invest more with regard to science, research and development. We have to promote innovation. We have to provide sustainable funding, consistent funding. Right now, if you look at what India spends on scientific research and development, India's spending is one of the lowest in the world. Among similarly ranked countries, if you compare India's budgetary expenditure, if you include the private sector expenditure as well, we are still one of the lowest spenders on scientific research and development. Please look at this important graph that the Hindu has shared. You can see the budgetary allocation as a percentage of GDP on scientific research and development. It has consistently been less than 1% of our GDP. If you take the last 7 decades, we have never spent more than 1% of our GDP on scientific research and development. Currently, our budgetary expenditure, which is usually measured as GERD, the gross expenditure on research and development. GERD stands for gross expenditure on R&D. It stands at 0.64% of our GDP, which is abysmally low compared to other countries. In the previous years, it was around 0.8%, 0.9%, 0.7%. It's always been under 1%, in the range of 0.6 to 1%. This is less than half of what other countries are spending. So this is where India loses out, which means you can't create enough research labs and facilities. You can't pay the researchers enough, right? There aren't lucrative opportunities in India, which pushes the talent to seek opportunities abroad. That's when we talk about brain drain, the drain of India's talent. They seek out better opportunities in European countries, in US, where they are paid better. So the lack of investment in scientific research and development is a concern. And this is despite the government focusing on science and research. Since many decades, in fact, right from India's independence, we have always understood the role of science, innovation, and research and development. Policy has always spoken about the importance of science and research and innovation. Leaders, governments have spoken about them. They've created some institutions, allocated some funds, but it hasn't been enough. For example, if you look at the 2013 policy on science, technology, and innovation, it set a goal for the government to increase GERD to 2% of our GDP, to double, more than double the gross expenditure on research and development. That was the goal set in 2013. But instead of achieving the goal and increasing our budget, we have reduced it. It has come down to just 0.64% of our GDP. The economic survey of 2017-18 also spoke about the need to increase allocation for science and technology, but it hasn't happened. So the basic point of the writer is that India is falling behind in research and development. We have already lost a number of years. So now if we have to catch up and become a developed country by 2047 in the next 2.5 decades, then we have to scale up our budgetary spending to 3% of our GDP. The writer says that even 2% of our GDP is not enough to fund scientific research and development. It should be scaled up to 3% consistently if we are to become a developed nation with a strong foundation in science, research, and innovation. So this is the gap in India's funding and expenditure on scientific research and development. Now let us compare this with other countries. Let us see where India actually stands. Without this comparison, we can't understand how much other countries are spending. If you look at the developed countries, for example, in the European market, if you look at the members of OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a European economic grouping, the OECD members are spending on an average 2.7% of their GDP consistently. If you look at US and UK, they have consistently allocated 2% of their GDP on scientific research. And this they have done for the last 30, 40, 50 years. That is how they became powerhouses of innovation. They became leaders in scientific research and development. They own most of the patents, most of the intellectual property. Their universities, research institutions, private companies, along with government institutions, they've all invested enough. And that is why they own intellectual property. They are the hub of knowledge and innovation. And this is what allows them to emerge as developed, powerful countries. So compared to them, India is far behind the curve. At one point, our spending was less than 0.5% of our GDP. Now it has come up to the range of 0.6 to 0.9%. The goal was 2% of our GDP, but we are nowhere close to it. Even now, if India is to achieve the status of a developed nation by 2047, we will have to spend 3% of our GDP consistently every year, which is unlikely. It's unlikely to happen. So that is why the writer is calling for increased and sustainable spending on scientific research and development. Not just from the government. It's not just the government's responsibility. Right? The private sector also has to contribute. Now, please look at the data presented here. You'll understand which sector is contributing how much to scientific research and development. The private sector in India contributes around 36.4%. Out of the total spending that we make on scientific research, around 36.4% is coming from the private sector. You might think this is a very high number, but it's not. If you compare this with developed countries, let's say US or let's say Belgium or Netherlands, their private sector is spending almost 60 to 70% of the funds compared to hardly 36-37% in India's private sector. So in India, the biggest spender on research and development is the central government. The central government share is the highest through various schemes that are sponsored by the central government. It is the center which spends the maximum, almost 43% on research and development, followed by private sector. States have a small share along with higher education and the public sector industries. So public sector organizations, government-owned entities and companies, state governments and higher education, universities and research institutions, they also make a minor contribution. But private sector and government of India, they are the biggest spenders on research and development. But what the private sector is spending in India, it's not enough. As I told you, in developed countries, their share is almost double. In US and European markets, even in Japan, in Australia, even in China, private sector, they are spending anywhere between 60 to 70% of the funds. So government actually spends less, but private sector is spending more. But that is not the case with India, which means our private sector is hesitant. It's not that they don't have money. Money is not the problem. They are hesitant to spend the money. They are hesitant to make those investments. Why? Because there are regulatory problems. There are administrative challenges. There is no clarity about the policy, the regulations in the country. The private sector is not fully confident that the government will create the right regulatory framework for them to utilize the funds, to spend and reap the results out of it. They're not guaranteed about the return on investment. Today, if they invest millions of dollars, there's no guarantee that they'll reap the profits at a later point in time. Because in India, there are problems related to intellectual property laws. IP laws are not up to acceptable levels, right? The government support that exists, even though there is a lot of focus at the highest levels, when it trickles down in the system, right? The private sector feels that they don't get enough support from the government. They feel that there are too many regulations, too many restrictions, too many policy constraints, and they hesitate to invest more in research and development. That is why our private sector is invested only around 36-37% compared to almost 70% in developed countries. So this is a problem that we need to solve. We need to have a very simple, clear-cut policy. We need to guarantee that the investments will be protected. The intellectual property created through such research will be protected. We have to create incentives for the private sector, right? In fact, the government can actually take a back step. It only has to enable, create the right environment, the right framework, and encourage the private sector to bring in the money. That is the only way through which we can create sustainable, consistent funding up to 3% of our GDP. So that is the solution being suggested by the writer as well. Government of India has set up various funds to sponsor research and development. For example, we have Anusandhan National Research Foundation, right? Recently, the National Research Foundation has been revamped and a lot of support is being provided through the central government. The center has tried to bring foreign experts as well, foreign professors and experts and researchers, and incentivize them to teach in India, to do research in India. But these programs are only temporary solutions, right? These are only short-term fixes. It's like putting a band-aid on a major wound. That will not help in healing. What you need is a permanent fix. You need long-term solutions. And to do that, you need to create a right regulatory environment, encourage the private industry, incentivize them to invest more in research and development. That is the only way forward. And also, what is ironic is that even with the limited budget allocated by the government, there is underutilization. If you look at the key institutions, for example, if you look at CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, right? Under CSIR, there are many labs and organizations and institutions. It is given a significant budget every year, but every year there is underutilization of the budget. If you look at Department of Biotechnology, if you look at Ministry of Science and Technology, they are all underutilizing the budgetary allocation. Even the limited budget which is given to them, they're not spending it entirely. Every year they are left with some money which is just rolled over into the next year. So this again is a flaw due to poor planning, poor execution of schemes and research projects. That is why the writer is saying that there is a need to create a sustainable funnel through which regular, consistent funding can be provided. Government alone cannot do this. It has to work with the private sector, incentivize the private sector, bring at least 70% from the private sector itself. The rest 30% will anyways come from government institutions. You have DRDO, CSIR labs, then you have ISRO, right? Public sector organizations, various central sector and central sponsored schemes, state government schemes, that will anyways account for at least 30% or more than 30%. at least 60 to 70% has to be brought from private sector, and for that the government has to create the right framework and the right environment. That is how sustainable, consistent funding can be created, and that is how largely other developed countries have done, and that is the reason why they've succeeded in research and innovation. So that is the roadmap that the writer is laying out for India's scientific future. The next article, the third article, related to internal security. The topic is related to insurgency in Manipur and a particular insurgent group from Manipur. This article is referring to the UNLF, the United National Liberation Front of Manipur, which is a Meitei insurgent outfit. It was established in the year 1964, and it was one of the notorious insurgent groups that was involved in Manipur's insurgency. Now, you all know that in the last 1 year, Manipur is going through a brutal cycle of violence, largely due to ethnic divisions within Manipur. Right? The ethnic violence that we have seen over the last 1 year is related to its history of insurgency and ethnic divide in the state. If you look at Manipur, you have the Imphal region, the valley region, which is where the Meitei community is found. The Meiteis are the majority community. They are larger in number, they are more influential, right? They are descendants of the royal Meitei Empire, the Meitei kingdom, which ruled the princely state of Manipur. But in the hill areas around the Imphal region, you have tribal communities like the Nagas, Kukis, and other tribal communities. So there is a history of divisions and violence between Meiteis and Nagas, Meiteis and Kukis. So the recent violence that you see from last year, it's primarily between the majority Meiteis from Imphal region and the Kuki-Zo community in the hill region. The Zo-Zomi community, they are from Myanmar, right? They have crossed over from Myanmar. Kukis and Zo-Zomi community are connected to each other. So culturally, historically, they are connected, and because of the given situation in Myanmar, the current crisis in Myanmar, several Zo-Zomi refugees have crossed over into Manipur and they are sheltered by the Kuki community. So the increasing population of the Zo-Zomi community, their control over the hill area, the question of scheduled tribe status, this is what led to the latest cycle of violence. But this issue has persisted since 1960s. In 1960s, 70s, the ethnic divisions between these tribal groups had given rise to a brutal insurgent conflict where multiple insurgent organizations were formed. The Nagas were leading their own insurgency, led by Naga National Council, NSCN, and other insurgent groups. The Kuki groups had formed their own armed separatist organizations trying to fight for a separate state called Kuki land. And the Meiteis formed their own armed groups, and one of them was the UNLF. So UNLF was a notorious insurgent outfit which would target the hill tribes, be it Kukis or Nagas. They would target them, and they were fighting against the Indian state. The goal was to liberate Manipur from India, break it away from India, as they opposed the merger with India, the merger of Manipur with India back in 1940s. They believed that this was a forceful merger of the princely Meitei state into the Indian Union, right? And they felt that they were being discriminated. When scheduled tribe status was granted to Kukis and Nagas, Meiteis felt left out. So as a result, Meitei groups had started their insurgent war against India, a separatist war, and one notorious group was the UNLF, United National Liberation Front. This group is a designated terrorist organization. It is designated under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, under UAPA. All right? After nearly 5-6 decades of its insurgency, it recently surrendered. Just 2.5 months ago, in December 2023, there was a major achievement for the government of India when a peace accord was signed with UNLF. The government of India managed to work out a peace accord which was signed between Ministry of Home Affairs, the state government of Manipur, and this Meitei insurgent group, that is UNLF. Now, when a peace accord is signed, right, there are few basic steps that will follow. We have signed such peace accords with other insurgent groups as well. For example, we have signed a peace accord with the Mizo outfits like Mizo National Front, right? We have the Mizo peace accord that stabilized Mizoram. Recently, we are negotiating a peace accord with Naga outfits like NSC and IM. We have signed peace accords with few other outfits, including Bodo organizations. We have completely brought Bodo insurgency to an end in the Bodoland region, right? And provided autonomy as well, constitutional autonomy under 6th schedule to the Bodo areas. So India has a history of working out peace accords with insurgent organizations, and this is one way of conflict resolution through talks and negotiations. So in December 2023, just around 2.5–3 months ago, Government of India achieved a remarkable achievement by striking this peace accord with UNLF. Once the peace accord is signed, there are a few basic steps. One, the insurgent group has to surrender. The insurgent group has to lay down its arms and weapons. And the insurgents are confined to a permanent camp. A designated camp has to be identified where the members are confined within this camp. They can't go out of this camp without permissions. Then there will be a monitoring force to monitor their activities. Either a central armed police force or the state police force will be deployed as the monitoring force under the peace accord. Now, for example, with the Kuki Zo insurgent groups, the government of Manipur had signed a suspension of operations agreement few years ago. According to that agreement, the Kuki insurgents, they were brought into a permanent camp. They have to stay within the camp. They have to surrender, lay down their arms and weapons. They are under the control of the security forces. They regularly audit the arms and weapons as well, so that they don't steal or misuse those weapons. And during the peace process, they have to ensure that they stay in the camp and their activities are monitored by the monitoring force. We have done this with other insurgent groups as well in the past. Like NSC and IM, for example, it has signed a framework agreement in 2015 and it is negotiating a peace process. So as a part of the agreement, NSC and cadres are confined to a permanent camp. They're supposed to surrender their weapons and a monitoring force is supposed to monitor them. But under the UNLF peace accord, these arrangements have not been worked out. That is what the article is talking about. The article is mentioning that for UNLF cadres, the members of UNLF, there is no permanent camp designated. There is no guarantee that they have surrendered all their weapons and arms. And there is no monitoring force which has been assigned. Either a central armed police force like Assam Rifles of the Home Ministry or the state police force should have been given control to monitor those camps. But that has not been done. And as a result, there are reports that UNLF members are resorting to extortion. Meaning they still have access to weapons. There are few UNF insurgents who are still roaming around outside and threatening people and extorting money. Right? Most of these insurgents, they get involved in such criminal activities. They rely on organized crime. They get involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking. They levy their own illegal taxes and extort money from local people and businesses. They don't allow trucks to pass through. They make every truck pay a ransom to them. So many insurgents have done this in the past. For example, NSCN itself, the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, it has resorted to such extortionist activities to sustain its operations. So now there are reports that UNLF is doing the same. It's resorting to extortion and criminal activities even after signing the peace accord. Because the government has not designated a permanent camp, there is no monitoring force to monitor them, and there's no guarantee that all of them have surrendered. There's no guarantee that they have laid down their arms and weapons because there is no force to keep a check on them. So that is why there is a concern in Manipur that this could easily get out of hand. What if these insurgents again pick fights with the Kuki groups and what if it results in a next wave of violence? Because things in Manipur have not settled, and one incident is enough to flare up the tensions and result to a cycle of ethnic violence between both the sides. So that is the concern expressed by this important article. And now let's proceed to the prelims section. In the prelims section, we have few small articles. There are two important articles on page 1 and page 16. Yesterday was a very important day for India's space sector because Prime Minister Modi inaugurated few important initiatives of ISRO. One important initiative was the announcement of the first batch of Indian astronauts who have been picked and trained for India's first human spaceflight program, that is the Gaganyaan mission. Gaganyaan is ISRO's ambitious upcoming human spaceflight program. This is India's first indigenous manned spaceflight program. The initial goal, when it was announced in 2018, was to send the astronauts into a low Earth orbit by 2022. But because of the pandemic and various delays in development of key technologies and testing, the cycle has been delayed. And now we are looking at a deadline of 2025. Hopefully by next year, India will be launching the Gaganyaan mission and a crew module will be deployed in the low Earth orbit, roughly between 300 to 500 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. And the crew module will orbit the Earth for a few days, ranging from 5 to 7 days, almost a week, right? And these Indian astronauts, 3 of them, will be spending this time in space conducting various scientific experiments. So for this ambitious manned spaceflight program, 4 pilots from the Indian Air Force have been finalized. There was an initial batch of fighter pilots chosen from the Indian Air Force. After rigorous training, 4 of them have been finalized, and you can see them over here. The names of these pilots is provided over here. So yesterday they graduated as Indian astronauts. The Prime Minister provided them with the astronaut wings, thus officially designating them as astronauts or Indian astronauts. They have undergone rigorous astronaut training in Russia with the help of Roscosmos. Russia is a key partner in training the Indian astronauts for the Gaganyaan mission. Plus, there is an astronaut training facility which has come up at Bengaluru. Right? At the astronaut training facility in Bengaluru, these 4 Indian astronauts have undergone rigorous training, and finally 3 of them will be chosen. 1 of them will be on standby as a backup. 3 of them will be chosen on the upcoming mission, which is going to be launched next year. So in the Gaganyaan mission, which will be launched by the GSLV Mark III, which is the most powerful rocket with ISRO, right? Which also contains the cryogenic stage, the cryogenic engine. It's going to lift off with a service module and a crew module. The astronauts will be stationed here. The 3 astronauts will be stationed in the crew module. The service module provides all the life support requirements, and the module will be deployed in a low Earth orbit for a few days, and the astronauts will be spending this time in space conducting various scientific experiments. So this will mark India's foray into outer space with a manned mission. So this would be a very complex mission. It requires many complex technologies to be tested out. First of all, you have to ensure the safety of the crew. That is the utmost priority, right? There are 100 things which might go wrong. The mission might fail given the complexity of the mission. So it's of utmost importance to ensure that the crew is protected at all times, starting right from the launch pad to the launch sequence, to the orbital sequence, and even to with regard to the re-entry of the crew module, right? It will re-enter the atmosphere, and this re-entry process will create massive friction, thousands of degrees of temperature, which will heat up and burn the crew module. So throughout the re-entry phase, the crew module has to be protected. It will splash down in the Indian Ocean, right? In the Bay of Bengal or in the Indian Ocean, and the crew will have to be safely recovered after that. The crew module will have to deploy parachutes as well to slow down the splashdown. So there are many technologies that are needed to ensure the success of the mission, and more importantly to ensure the safety of the crew. So all these technologies are being tested out by ISRO one by one. In the last couple of years, many critical technologies are being tested out. For example, the pad abort test. If something goes wrong on the launch pad, let's say the launch fails, the launch has to be aborted, then the crew module has to be ejected out to ensure that astronauts are safe and protected, right? Integrated airdrop test to check whether the crew module can splash down safely in the seas and the oceans. That is a critical test which is being done. Then test vehicle missions, testing out the insertion of the crew module, the whole orbital sequence. Then finally carrying out a full unmanned flight without the crew, without the astronauts. And then comes the final step, the manned mission itself. So multiple steps are involved. This will also require India to ensure that we have full expertise in space medicine, space clothing, to create the right safe environment for the astronauts. So India is collaborating with US, France and Russia for some key technologies, but rest of it would largely be an indigenous mission. So please be aware of the basic details of the Gaganyaan mission, and also note that the Prime Minister has announced yesterday that India will have its own space station by 2035. Similar to the International Space Station, which is a collaborative project between US, Russia and European countries. And similar to China's own space station, India also plans to have its own space station by 2035. That was another important announcement by the Prime Minister. Next, on the same page, on the front page, there is another article related to science and technology. The Department of Biotechnology has announced that the Human Genome Project of India, also called the 10,000 Genome Project, has been completed. Is that clear? So this project essentially creates a database of the entire human genomic sequence. Genomic studies are very crucial to understand the genetic makeup of our population. If you look at India, we are a country of 1.4 billion people, right? There are different sets of people with different genetic variations and genetic origins. There are few endogamous communities, especially indigenous tribal communities, which are not exposed to other groups, and their genetic composition has largely remained endogamous, which makes them more prone and vulnerable to genetic disorders, diseases, etc. You might have read that few tribal communities are more vulnerable for sickle cell disease, which is a genetic disorder, right? It's because some of the tribes are endogamous. They haven't bred with other tribes and other communities, and there is no genetic diversity within those groups. Plus, within the Indian population, there are thousands of different population groups, and according to this scientific study, there are 4,600 population groups in India with different genetic ancestries. So, sequencing the genome of the Indian population and creating a database was the purpose of the Human Genome Project, the 10,000 Genome Project. There is a similar global project as well, the Human Genome Global Project, led by the United States, which has also been completed, where the entire human genome sequence has been brought out and a database has been created. Now, what is the purpose of this? Once the human genome sequence is available and once a database is created, this will be very useful in genetic studies. It will be very useful to understand genetic disorders, genetic predisposition to certain diseases like cancer or even heart attack, and appropriately design diagnostics, design better drugs, treatments and therapies. You can prevent many genetic diseases and disorders. You can design better treatments, better drugs, vaccines as well, right? To protect the population groups in India, especially the endogamous populations in India. So that is why this is a critical scientific project. It was led by multiple institutions, including Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru, and the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, Hyderabad. So many institutions have contributed to this massive project. They drew blood samples from thousands of Indians, which is all stored in a biobank. A biobank was created for this project. 20,000 blood samples were stored from where the genetic sequence was drawn, and 10,000 genome sequence has been drawn and it has been databased. So this project is now complete according to Department of Biotechnology. Coming to the last article from Environment and Ecology. On page number 6, please make a correction, this is page number 6 here. There is a reference to the Simplipal Tiger Reserve, right? There is an article referring to the need for more female tigers from other regions in Simplipal, and the National Tiger Conservation Authority is trying to arrange for more female tigers in Simplipal, because to manage the population levels, to ensure a healthy breeding population, right, more female tigers are needed in this protected area. That's what the article is referring to. So from a prelims point of view, you should know more about the Simplipal Tiger Reserve. The Simplipal Tiger Reserve is a national park and a biosphere reserve as well. It is located in the state of Odisha in the Mayurbhanj district. It's one of the critical habitats in India. It's an extension of the Eastern Ghat ranges, and it is recognized under the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Program. It's one of the biospheres in India, and it is part of the World Network of Biosphere Reserves, which is part of the Man and Biosphere Program of UNESCO. So it is home to many threatened species. You have a healthy tiger population, the elephants. You also have the gaur or the Indian bison, which is listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. Even the chausinga, which is a antelope, which is also listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List, can be found in the Simplipal Tiger Reserve and National Park. Other important fact you can understand from here is that the NTCA administers all the tiger reserves in India. The National Tiger Conservation Authority It implements Project Tiger for tiger conservation, and it is managing more than 50 tiger reserves in the country. So any decisions related to the management of tiger reserves is taken by the NTCA, National Tiger Conservation Authority. So these are the key points that we take away from today's newspaper, and we will end the session with 2 practice questions. Kindly make a note of these mains questions which you can use for your answer writing practice. So this concludes my discussion for today. I hope you guys have liked the session. If you did, do let me know in the comments, press the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.